July 1st, 1916. 7:28 a.m. The Somme. 22-year-old Private William Fletcher stands in a trench near Beaumont Hamel, waiting for the whistle that will send him over the top. His hands shake as he grips his rifle, not from fear, though there's plenty of that, from the ground itself, trembling beneath his feet. For 7 days, British artillery has pounded German positions. 1.5 million shells. The noise is beyond description. It doesn't just assault your ears, it invades your chest, your bones, your teeth. Men have gone mad from the sound alone. The officers promised it would be a walkover, the wire cut, the Germans dead in their trenches. All Fletcher and his mates have to do is stroll across no man's land and occupy the enemy positions. They've been told to walk, not run, to maintain formation. That the Germans couldn't possibly have survived the bombardment. At 7:30 a.m., the whistles blow. Fletcher climbs the ladder, steps onto the fire step, and walks into hell. Within minutes, he's one of 60,000 British casualties, the single bloodiest day in British military history. Boys cut down by machine guns that weren't supposed to exist anymore, wire that wasn't supposed to still be there. Germans who were very much alive and waiting. But this isn't the story of that slaughter, horrific as it was. Entire libraries have been written about the first day of the Somme, the tactical failures, the generals who sacrificed a generation on barbed wire and bullets. This is the story of what came after. When the guns finally fell silent, when survivors ventured into no man's land to search for the wounded, to bury the dead, to somehow make sense of what they'd witnessed. What they found out there broke them in ways that bullets and shells couldn't, not because of the horror, though there was horror beyond measure, but because of something they never expected to encounter in that wasteland of death: humanity, compassion, the enemy weeping beside them. This is the story of how men discovered that the line between enemy and brother is thinner than the mud of the Somme, and how that discovery haunted them for the rest of their lives. Private William Fletcher survived July 1st, 1916, barely. A German bullet grazed his helmet, stunning him. He fell into a shell crater and stayed there as the attack wave passed over him. Stayed there as the second wave went over, and the third, each wave smaller than the last. Each wave cut down just as efficiently as the one before. He was 19 years old, from Manchester. Before the war, he'd worked in his uncle's bakery, getting up at 4 in the morning to prepare the day's bread. He'd joined up in 1915, part of Kitchener's new army, caught up in the wave of patriotic fervour that swept Britain after the initial volunteers had already been fed into the trenches. By July 1916, that fervour had curdled into something else. Everyone knew someone who'd died. The casualty lists filled newspaper pages, but the recruiters kept their promises. Serve your country, do your duty, be a hero. The alternative was a white feather in the mail, the mark of cowardice. So Fletcher had gone, and now he lay in a shell crater on the Somme, covered in mud and blood, listening to the screams of wounded men lying in no man's land. Screams that would continue for 3 days. Screams that would haunt his dreams for 60 years. Around him in the British trenches that morning were thousands like him. Men from the PALS battalions, entire communities that had enlisted together. The Accrington PALS, the Sheffield City Battalion, the Grimsby Chums. The recruiters had promised they could serve alongside their friends, their neighbours, their brothers. What they didn't mention was that they would die alongside them too. Lieutenant James Bliss of the 1st Lancashire Fusiliers was 23. Cambridge educated, from a good family. He'd been given a commission based on his class, not his training. Like most junior officers, his life expectancy could be measured in weeks. He'd gone over the top at 7:30 with his platoon, watched 27 of his 30 men cut down in the first 100 yards, made it to the German wire and discovered it wasn't cut at all. Tried to lead his remaining men around it, took a bullet through the shoulder and another through the leg, crawled into a shell crater and waited. Sergeant Robert Thompson, 32, regular army, veteran of the Boer War. He'd seen combat before, knew what bullets sounded like, what it felt like to be shot at, but nothing had prepared him for this, the sheer industrial scale of the slaughter. Men not dying in combat, but being massacred before they could even engage the enemy. Thompson made it further than most, almost to the German trenches, close enough to see the machine gunners' faces, close enough to recognize that they looked as young and terrified as his own men. Then a shell landed 3 yards away, and the world became noise and darkness and pain. When he woke, he couldn't hear anything, couldn't feel his left arm. And he was lying next to a dead German soldier who couldn't have been more than 17. These were the men in no man's land on July 1st, 1916, the ones who didn't die immediately, the wounded, the trapped, the ones lying in shell craters and torn up earth, waiting for nightfall, waiting for rescue, waiting to see if they'd bleed out before help arrived. And scattered among them, in far smaller numbers, were the German wounded, men caught in the British barrage, or hit by rifle fire as they manned the parapets, or simply in the wrong place when a shell landed. For 3 days, both armies largely left no man's land alone. Too dangerous. The machine guns still covered every approach. Snipers waited for any movement. Artillery had the range zeroed in. Going out there in daylight was suicide. So the wounded waited and screamed and died slowly. The sound of it drove men mad, sitting in trenches, listening to their mates crying for help, crying for their mothers, crying for water, crying for someone to end it, and being unable to do anything. Some men tried, brave men, foolish men, men who couldn't stand it anymore. They'd go over the top in daylight, running toward the screams. Most were shot before they covered 10 yards. The sound of those screams would later be described by survivors as worse than any battle, any bombardment, any horror the war produced. The sound of men dying slowly while their friends listened, helpless. By July 4th, many of the wounded had died, but not all. The ones in deep shell craters, protected from direct fire, the ones who'd found water in flooded craters, the ones with wounds that hurt terribly but weren't immediately fatal. They were still out there, and that's when the orders came down. Both sides, independently, came to the same conclusion. They had to retrieve their wounded, had to bury their dead, had to do something about no man's land before disease turned it into something even worse than a battlefield. Unofficial truces were arranged. Not high-level, not official. Local commanders, German and British, using signals and intermediaries. We'll hold fire for 2 hours. You retrieve your wounded. We'll retrieve ours. No tricks. No attacks. Private Fletcher was still in his shell crater on July 4th when he heard German voices. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but he couldn't find it, lost in 3 days of mud and blood and delirium. The voices got closer. He tried to make himself smaller, hoping they'd pass by. And then a face appeared over the rim of the crater. A German soldier, young, maybe 18, wearing the Feldgrau uniform and the distinctive German helmet, carrying a stretcher with a Red Cross armband. Fletcher waited to die, or be taken prisoner. He wasn't sure which was worse. The German soldier looked at him, really looked at him, saw the blood, the wounds, the state he was in, and said, in heavily accented English, "Do not fear, we help you." Fletcher would later tell his children that he thought he was hallucinating, that surely a German soldier wasn't offering to help him, a British soldier, in the middle of no man's land. But then the German climbed into the crater, called to his companions. 2 more German medics appeared. They examined Fletcher's wounds with professional efficiency, gave him water from a German canteen, bandaged his worst injuries with German medical supplies. And then they did something that Fletcher couldn't process, couldn't understand. that would fundamentally alter his understanding of war and enemy and humanity. They picked him up, a British soldier, and carried him toward the German trenches. Fletcher panicked, tried to struggle. The German medic holding his shoulders said quietly, "Your lines. We take you to your lines. Not prisoner. We help you home." And they did. 3 German soldiers carried a wounded British soldier across no man's land, through their own wire, past their own trenches, and delivered him to the British lines, handed him over to British stretcher-bearers, and walked back to their own trenches. Fletcher would spend the next 60 years trying to explain to people what that moment meant, how it shattered everything he thought he knew about the enemy, how those 3 German soldiers, who were supposed to be monsters, had saved his life and asked for nothing in return. But Fletcher's story was just one among hundreds. Lieutenant Bliss, lying wounded for 3 days, was found by a British stretcher party on July 4th. As they carried him back, he kept calling for his men, the ones who'd died, the ones he'd left in no man's land. One of the stretcher-bearers, a corporal named Davies, said quietly, "Sir, the Germans are helping bring them in. Both sides are out there now. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen." From his stretcher, Bliss could see it. British and German soldiers working in the same space, sometimes passing within feet of each other, retrieving their respective dead and wounded, not speaking much, not fraternizing like the Christmas truce of 1914, but not shooting either, just men doing the grim work of war, together. In one sector, near Thiepval, a German officer approached a British officer with a request. They'd found a badly wounded British soldier in a crater between the lines, too badly wounded to move safely. The German doctor had examined him and determined that he needed immediate surgery, or he'd die. The German trenches were closer, their aid station better equipped for this particular emergency. Would the British allow them to take the soldier back to German lines for treatment, with the promise he'd be returned when he was stable? The British officer, Captain Morrison of the 8th East Lancashire Regiment, had no guidance for this situation. No regulation covered whether you should allow the enemy to save your men. He made a decision based not on military doctrine, but on humanity. "Save him," he said. The German officer nodded. "We will return him when he is well." And they did. 3 weeks later, during another local truce for wounded retrieval, the same German officer found the same British officer and returned the soldier, now bandaged and recovering, along with a letter from the German doctor detailing the surgery and recommended follow-up care. Morrison would later write in his diary, "I don't know how to record this officially. How do I report that the enemy saved one of my men? That they gave him back? What does that make them? What does that make this war?" But what haunted survivors most wasn't these extraordinary acts of mercy. It was something quieter, something that happened over and over in those days after July 1st. Sergeant Thompson, deaf and wounded, was being carried back to British lines by stretcher-bearers when they had to pause. Another stretcher team was coming from the opposite direction. German stretcher-bearers, carrying a German casualty. The 2 teams met in the middle of no man's land, paused, looked at each other, both exhausted, both covered in mud and blood, both carrying dying men. One of the German medics looked at Thompson lying on the stretcher, looked at the British stretcher-bearers, nodded once, a tiny gesture of recognition, of shared burden. The British stretcher-bearer nodded back. Then both teams continued on their way, German wounded going to German lines, British wounded to British lines. Thompson, watching this exchange, felt something inside him crack. Here, in the deadliest place on earth, in the aftermath of the worst battle Britain had ever fought, enemies had acknowledged each other's humanity. And that acknowledgement was somehow more devastating than the bullets and shells, because it raised the question that military training is designed to suppress. If the enemy is human like us, suffering like us, grieving like us, then what are we doing to each other? What broke them wasn't the horror. Soldiers can adapt to horror, can build walls around their humanity to survive it. What broke them was seeing the enemy's humanity up close, in ways that couldn't be dismissed or rationalized. When British stretcher-bearers found German wounded in no man's land, they faced a choice: leave them to die, or help them. Military doctrine was clear: the enemy is the enemy. But doctrine hadn't prepared them for this, for looking into the face of a dying German boy, who could have been their brother, begging for water in a language they couldn't understand, but needed no translation. Private Henry Russell of the 2nd Royal Welsh Fusiliers found a German soldier in a crater on July 5th. The man had lost both legs to a shell, had been lying there for 4 days, was still somehow alive. Russell had no medical training, no supplies beyond basic field dressings, and this was the enemy. A German, one of the men whose machine guns had killed half his battalion. He could have walked away, should have walked away. His orders were to retrieve British wounded only. But the German soldier looked at him with eyes that held no hatred, no aggression, just pain and hope and a desperate, wordless plea. Russell sat down in the crater, gave the German soldier water from his own canteen, used his own field dressing on wounds that were obviously mortal, sat with him while he died, which took another 30 minutes. The German soldier said things in German that Russell couldn't understand, but near the end, he pulled a photograph from his pocket, showed it to Russell. A young woman holding a baby, wife and child, universal language. Russell held the photograph while the man died, then he took it with him. After the war, he would spend 2 years trying to find that German soldier's widow, to return the photograph and tell her that her husband hadn't died alone, that an enemy had sat with him, that his last moments held some measure of dignity and companionship. He never found her, but he kept the photograph for the rest of his life, carried it in his wallet for 60 years. His family found it after he died, along with a note. "I don't know his name. I killed his comrades, but I couldn't let him die alone. I still don't know if that makes me a good soldier or a bad one." That moral confusion, that shattering of certainties, affected thousands of men in the aftermath of the Somme. Captain Eric Whitworth was tasked with supervising burial details in the 2nd week of July. His men would go out at night, under truce conditions, to bury the dead in mass graves dug in no man's land. It was soul-destroying work. Bodies had been lying in summer heat for over a week. Identification was often impossible. They'd bury men in graves marked unknown British soldier or unknown German soldier, knowing that families would never have closure, never know where their sons and fathers and brothers lay. On July 10th, Whitworth's detail encountered a German burial party working the same area. Both teams paused, waited to see what would happen. The German officer in charge stepped forward, saluted Whitworth, gestured to the bodies scattered across no man's land, said in perfect English, "There are too many. Perhaps we could work together." Whitworth later wrote, "It was the most surreal conversation of my life. We were discussing how to efficiently bury the men we'd been killing less than 2 weeks earlier. The German officer was educated, spoke of Keats and Byron, had studied at Oxford before the war. We might have been friends in another life." They worked together through the night, British and German soldiers, digging graves side by side, lifting bodies together. Often you couldn't tell which uniform was which through the mud and decomposition. Saying prayers over mixed graves, German chaplains blessing British dead, British chaplains blessing German dead. At one point, a young British private broke down weeping. A German soldier, perhaps 20 years old himself, put a hand on the British soldier's shoulder. Didn't say anything, just stood there with him while he cried. Whitworth watched this, watched enemy soldiers comforting each other, watched the walls between armies dissolve in the face of shared grief. He wrote in his diary, "We are doing something terrible to each other, and we all know it. but we don't know how to stop. The truces for recovering wounded and burying dead continued through July. They were never official, never sanctioned at high levels. Local commanders arranged them out of necessity and basic human decency. Some lasted hours, some lasted days, but they couldn't last forever. By late July, senior commanders on both sides were aware of what was happening, and they were horrified, not because of the casualties, they could accept casualties, but because soldiers on both sides were recognizing each other's humanity, were beginning to see the enemy as men like themselves. This was dangerous. This threatened the entire war effort. If soldiers saw their enemies as human beings, they might hesitate to kill them, might question the necessity of the war itself. Orders came down, no more truces, no more cooperation. Anyone caught fraternizing with the enemy would face court-martial. Artillery bombardments were scheduled to prevent informal truces from developing. Snipers were ordered to fire at anyone entering no man's land. Units that had faced each other were rotated away, replaced with fresh troops who hadn't shared those experiences. The war had to continue, and for that, the enemy had to remain the enemy. But for the men who'd been there, who'd shared those spaces with the enemy, who'd seen German soldiers weep over British dead, and British soldiers close the eyes of dying Germans, something had changed permanently. Private Fletcher, recovered from his wounds, was sent back to the front in August. Different sector, different German regiment opposite them. Men who hadn't helped save British wounded. Men who were, the officers assured them, the real enemy. But Fletcher couldn't unsee what he'd seen, couldn't forget the German medics who'd saved his life. When he was ordered to fire at German troops, he aimed high. Not obviously so, not enough to be noticed, but he couldn't bring himself to kill men who might be like those medics. He wasn't alone. Unofficially, in sectors where troops had shared those experiences after July 1st, there was a noticeable decrease in aggressive patrolling, in accuracy of fire, in enthusiasm for raiding parties. Not enough to be called mutiny, not enough to be punished, but enough to be noticed. The men had seen something in no man's land that they weren't supposed to see, and it had changed them. Lieutenant Bliss returned to duty in October, was promoted to captain, led men in the final phases of the Somme offensive, which would grind on until November with diminishing returns and mounting casualties. He did his duty, led attacks, ordered men over the top, watched them die, but he wrote letters home that his family found years later, letters that revealed the cost of what he'd experienced. "I killed a German officer today," one letter read. "Shot him at 30 yards, clean through the chest. He fell, and I watched him die. It took about 3 minutes, and all I could think about was the German officer who carried wounded to both our lines. Was this the same man? Different man? Does it matter? I've killed someone who might have saved lives, or I've killed someone who would have killed my men. I don't know which is worse, that I'll never know, or that I'm not sure it matters anymore." Another letter, written after a particularly costly attack in October. "We gained 50 yards today, cost us 40 men. The generals call it progress. I call it arithmetic. We're trading lives for land, British lives for French mud, and the Germans are doing the same thing. We're all trapped in a machine that's eating us alive, and no one knows how to turn it off. After July, after seeing them help us, I can't shake the feeling that we're all victims of this war, even the Germans, especially the Germans, because they know it too." Bliss would survive the war, return to Cambridge, try to resume his studies, and fail. He'd sit in libraries where he'd once loved learning, and all he could see was no man's land. All he could hear was the screams of wounded men. All he could remember was German soldiers carrying British casualties to British lines. He never finished his degree, took a job teaching at a small school in the countryside, never married, died in 1943 at age 50, from complications of old wounds, and his doctor noted, from something that looked like a broken heart. Sergeant Thompson survived as well, lost his arm but kept his life, was invalided out in 1917, returned to his wife and children in Liverpool, tried to explain to them what he'd seen. Couldn't find the words. His daughter, interviewed in the 1980s for an oral history project, said he'd wake up screaming, not from nightmares of battle, though he had those, but from dreams about the German boy lying next to him when he woke up wounded, the dead boy who looked so young. Dad said he couldn't stop wondering if that boy had helped carry wounded British soldiers before he died, if maybe that boy had been one of the ones showing mercy, and if Dad had killed him earlier that day without knowing it. That question haunted him until he died. The Somme offensive officially ended in November 1916. Britain and France had advanced roughly 6 miles, at a cost of over 600,000 casualties. The Germans had lost roughly 500,000. The battle had achieved none of its strategic objectives, hadn't broken the German lines, hadn't won the war, had simply killed over 1 million men for 6 miles of devastated earth that would be lost and retaken multiple times in the years to come. But it had accomplished something the generals never intended. It had shown the men who fought there that their enemies were human, that in the aftermath of slaughter, soldiers from both sides were capable of tremendous mercy and compassion, that the line between enemy and brother was arbitrary, drawn by politics and nationalism and strategic considerations that meant nothing to men dying in shell craters. The generals couldn't allow this knowledge to spread, couldn't allow soldiers to retain sympathy for the enemy, so they suppressed the stories, rotated units, increased propaganda about German atrocities, did everything possible to rebuild the walls between British and German soldiers. It worked, mostly. The war continued for 2 more years. Millions more died. The industrial slaughter reached heights that July 1916 had only hinted at. But the men who'd been there, who'd experienced those days after July 1st, when enemies worked together to save lives and bury dead, they never forgot. They carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Some were broken by it, some found meaning in it. All were changed by it. In 1968, 52 years after the battle, a group of Somme veterans, British, French, and German, met at the battlefield for a memorial service. They were old men now, in their 70s and 80s, survivors of a war that had killed most of their generation. A British veteran, former Private Fletcher, now 70 years old, was being filmed for a documentary. The interviewer asked him about his strongest memory of the Somme. Fletcher was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Everyone asks about July 1st, the attack, the slaughter, and yes, that was terrible. Worst thing I ever saw. But my strongest memory is from July 4th, when German medics found me in a shell crater and carried me to safety, when they saved my life and asked for nothing." He paused, looked directly at the camera. They were supposed to be the enemy. Everything we'd been told said they were monsters, but they weren't. They were men, just men, trying to survive the same hell we were. And when they had a choice, they chose mercy. Another pause. His voice broke slightly. "I've spent 50 years wondering how many of them I might have killed. How many men who would have helped a wounded enemy did I shoot? How many men who would have shown mercy did I show none? I'll never know. But that's what haunts me. Not the men who tried to kill me. That was war. But the men I killed who might have saved me if our positions had been reversed." At that same memorial service, a German veteran spoke. He'd been one of the soldiers retrieving wounded from no man's land in early July. He described finding British and German wounded in the same shell crater, the British soldier trying to give water to the German one, despite his own injuries. "That was when I understood," the German veteran said. "We were not really enemies. We were all just boys, sent to kill each other by old men who would never set foot in the trenches. The real enemy was the war itself. But we didn't know how to fight that enemy, so we fought each other instead and called it duty. The memorial service included a moment when British and German veterans embraced, men who might have tried to kill each other 50 years earlier, now crying on each other's shoulders, united by survival, by age, by the understanding that they'd all been victims of something larger than any of them. A French photographer captured an image that day. Two old men, one in a British Legion uniform, one wearing his German veterans' medals, standing together at a grave marker that read, "Unknown soldiers, British and German." They were holding hands. Both had tears running down their weathered faces. The photographer later said, "In that moment, I understood something about war. It creates enemies, yes, but it also creates a bond between those enemies that people who've never fought can't understand. They knew each other in a way the rest of us never could. They'd seen each other at the worst and best of humanity, and they'd survived, together in a strange way. The Battle of the Somme broke records for casualties, for futility, for the sheer waste of human life. It's remembered as one of the great disasters of military history, a cautionary tale about the cost of outdated tactics meeting modern weapons. But it also revealed something that military historians rarely discuss, that even in the worst circumstances humanity has created, human beings remain capable of extraordinary compassion, that soldiers, given the slightest opportunity, will choose to see their enemies as human beings, that mercy and kindness can flourish even in no man's land. The generals knew this was dangerous, knew that soldiers who saw enemies as human might refuse to kill them, so they did everything possible to maintain the dehumanization that makes war possible. But for the men who experienced those days after July 1st, 1916, it was too late. They'd seen the truth, and that truth haunted them, not because of what they'd seen the enemy do in battle, but because of what they'd seen the enemy do in mercy. Private Henry Russell, who'd sat with a dying German soldier in a shell crater, returned home to Wales after the war, became a schoolteacher, never spoke publicly about his war experiences, except once, in 1964, to a class studying World War I. A student asked him, "What was it like to fight the Germans?" Russell thought for a long time, then said, "I'll tell you what it was like. It was like fighting my brothers. And the worst part was knowing that's exactly what we were doing. Brothers killing brothers over land that belonged to neither of us. The Germans weren't monsters. They were boys from farms and cities just like us. They missed home just like us. They died in the mud just like us. And sometimes, when the killing stopped for a moment, they helped us bury our dead and we helped them bury theirs. Those moments of peace were harder than the moments of war, because they reminded us that none of it had to happen, that we could have chosen differently. But we didn't, and millions died because of it." He never taught that class again. The memories were too much. Captain Whitworth, who'd supervised burial parties with German officers, wrote a memoir in the 1950s that was never published. His family found it after his death. In it, he wrote, "People want to hear about heroism, about bravery under fire, about defeating the enemy. But the story I need to tell is different. It's about the night I worked alongside a German officer to bury the dead, about how we didn't speak much, but we both wept, about how we were doing the same terrible job, dealing with the same nightmare, and in that moment, nationality meant nothing. We were just two men, trying to give dignity to the dead, trying to preserve some scrap of humanity in hell." That German officer is dead now, killed at Verdun in 1917. I learned this years later through a chance connection. When I heard he'd died, I wept. For a man I'd met once, a man who was supposed to be my enemy, a man who showed me that war creates enemies of people who should be friends. I don't know how to reconcile that. I did my duty. I fought the war, but I also helped bury men alongside the people who'd killed them. And both the Germans and I knew, standing over those graves, that this was madness, that we were murdering each other over land that would outlast us all, that our governments had found reasons for war that had nothing to do with the men doing the fighting. If there's a lesson in this, it's not about bravery or duty or patriotism. It's that we are capable of terrible things, yes, but we're also capable of recognizing the humanity in our enemies. And that recognition doesn't make the killing stop. That's the tragedy. We saw each other as human and killed each other anyway, because we didn't know how to stop, because stopping would have meant admitting it should never have started. The Somme today is farmland again. Fields of wheat and barley grow where men once died by the tens of thousands. The craters have been filled in, the trenches ploughed under, the wire and shells and bones cleared away. But if you know where to look, you can still see traces. Slight depressions in the fields where craters were, unexpected bumps where trenches ran, and the cemeteries. Rows and rows of white headstones, British and German, marking where the dead still lie. Near Thiepval, there's a memorial to the missing. The names of 72,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers whose bodies were never found, lost in the mud, blown apart by shells, buried in unmarked graves by exhausted men who couldn't identify them. Those names represent individual tragedies, families who never got closure, mothers who never learned where their sons lay. But they also represent the men who tried to give them dignity. The burial parties, British and German, who worked through the night to lay the dead to rest, who recognized, even in death, that these were someone's sons and brothers and fathers. On the German side, similar memorials, similar lists of the missing, similar grief carved in stone. And if you stand in the right place, you can see both, British and German memorials, within sight of each other, separated by a few hundred yards of farmland that was once no man's land. That space between them, that used to be filled with wire and craters and corpses, that's where it happened, where enemies met, where German medics carried British wounded to safety, where British soldiers closed the eyes of dying Germans, where burial parties from both sides worked together under moonlight, united by grief and exhaustion and the terrible knowledge that this shouldn't be happening, that none of it should be happening, but they didn't know how to make it stop. Every year, on July 1st, there's a memorial service at the Somme. People come from around the world, descendants of men who fought there, history students, people who feel called to remember. At dawn, at 7:30 a.m., the exact moment the whistles blew in 1916, there's a moment of silence. And in that silence, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it. The whistle, the first machine gun fire, the screams of wounded men. But there's another sound too, harder to hear, but just as real. The sound of men helping their enemies, of mercy offered in hell, of humanity persisting where it shouldn't be possible. That's the story of the Somme that doesn't get told enough. Not the tactics, or the casualties, or the general's mistakes, but what it revealed about human nature. That even in our worst creations, even in industrial slaughter, we remain capable of compassion. That the first impulse, when face to face with a suffering enemy, is not to finish him off, but to help him. And that the real tragedy isn't that we're capable of war. It's that we're capable of recognizing our enemy's humanity and waging war anyway, that we can see the truth and ignore it, that we can help each other in the aftermath and return to killing each other the next day. Private Fletcher, the man saved by German medics, lived until 1982, died at 85, surrounded by grandchildren who knew nothing of war. In his final weeks, his mind wandered. He'd call out names, German names that his family didn't recognize. His daughter asked the hospice nurse what he was saying. The nurse, who spoke some German, listened carefully. "He's saying thank you. the nurse said, over and over. He's thanking someone named Klaus. Or maybe Karl. It's hard to tell. But he's definitely saying thank you in German. Fletcher's daughter found his war diary after he died. In it, written in shaky handwriting from 1916. They saved me. 3 German medics whose names I never learned. Klaus, I think one was called. Or maybe I imagined that. But they saved me. Carried me across no man's land like I was their brother. I've killed Germans since then. Done my duty. But I've never forgotten those 3. Never will. If there's a heaven, I hope I see them there. Hope I can finally learn their names. Hope I can say thank you properly. In this life, I never got the chance. That's what they found in no man's land that made them weep. Not just the horror and the waste and the dead, but the moments of unexpected mercy. The enemy soldier giving water to a British wounded. The British medic bandaging a German casualty. The burial parties crying together over mixed graves. The recognition that they were all victims of this war, all trapped in the same machinery of death, all desperate for it to end. They wept because they saw what war really was, not a noble struggle between good and evil, but a tragedy that destroyed everyone it touched. And they wept because even seeing that truth, understanding that truth, they didn't know how to escape it. So they did their duty, fought the war, killed the men who would have saved them, saved the men they would have to try to kill later, and carried that contradiction for the rest of their lives. That's the legacy of the Somme, not the territory gained or lost, not the tactical lessons learned, but the knowledge carried by survivors that war forces us to do terrible things to people who are exactly like us, and that sometimes, in brief moments when the killing stops, we remember that. We see each other clearly, and it breaks us in ways that bullets never could. If you want to understand World War I, don't just study the battles. Study what happened in the quiet moments after. Study the men who helped their enemies. Study the truces arranged by exhausted officers who couldn't stand listening to wounded men scream anymore. Study the burial parties that worked together, because grief transcends nationality. That's where the real story is, not in the fighting, but in the moments when the fighting stopped and men remembered they were human. And if there's a lesson for us now, more than a century later, it's this. We're capable of terrible things. We've proven that. But we're also capable of mercy, even toward our enemies. We've proven that too. The question is which we'll choose, which impulse we'll follow when the moment comes. The men of the Somme showed us both. In July 1916, they showed us the worst of what we can do to each other. And in the days after, they showed us the best, the choice to help rather than hurt, to show mercy rather than hatred, to recognize humanity even in hell. They expected death, found death, dealt death. But they also found something else out there in no man's land, something that stayed with them forever. They found that their enemies were men, just men. And that recognition changed everything, even if it changed nothing at all. Remember them. Remember what they saw. Remember what they learned. Remember that in our darkest moments, we're still capable of choosing compassion over cruelty. Remember the Somme, not just for the 60,000 casualties on the first day, but for what came after, when enemies became humans, and humans tried to help each other survive hell. That's the story that needs to be told. That's the truth that haunts us still. Thank you for listening, for bearing witness, for remembering that war is not just about the fighting, but about the moments between the battles when we remember what we're doing to each other. And sometimes, when we're lucky, when we're brave enough, when we're human enough, we stop. Even if just for a moment. Even if just long enough to carry a wounded enemy to safety. Even if just long enough to bury the dead together. Those moments matter. Those men matter. Their choice to show mercy matters. Remember them.